All right. Well, I think we are just about ready to get started. Welcome everyone again to our InDEEP webinar. We're really excited to be with you today as we kick off the first in a four-part series for InDEEP. My name is Sarah Padilla, and I am the Manager of Initiatives for Keisha Harris and Associates. And I see among the participants some familiar names and faces and some new folks I'm looking forward to getting to know. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We are going to be recording the first hour of this session that will be shared later with the InDEEP community. And the second hour will not be recorded. So you are welcome to pose a question or a comment in the chat box at any time throughout the session. And a little bit later, we will also be linking to a form for Q&A that you are welcome to populate as we go. So again, welcome to the first session of InDEEP's new virtual learning series, Environment Conservation and Racial Equity in Philanthropy. It's great to be with you here today, and I am going to turn it over to one of our session moderators, Keisha Harris. Keisha is the president and CEO of KHA and the director of the InDEEP initiative. So welcome, Keisha.
All right, and thanks so much, Sarah. Welcome to each of you, and we really appreciate you joining us for the first of 4 InDEEP virtual learning sessions. The series will engage funders and nonprofits who want to center racial equity and justice in the environmental sector. It's great to see many of you who are familiar with InDEEP. For those of you who are new, these webinars are offered as a part of the InDEEP initiative, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Environmental Philanthropy. For the past 4 years, we've curated this work, and it's one of 2 field building initiatives led by KHA in partnership with the Institute for Strategic, provides professional development opportunities for foundation staff and a transformative, constructive space to grapple with tough issues related to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. This virtual learning series includes a comprehensive look at environmental and conservation philanthropies, past, present, and future, engages BIPOC leaders from grant-seeking organizations, and provides a space for dialogue directly on the heels of what promises to be an historic 2020 presidential election. Our purpose today is to challenge your thinking about racial equity and justice practices as grant makers, while shoring up a sense of accountability and support for each other. Specifically today, we will hear from 2 leaders in the environment and conservation nonprofit space on their experience working with the philanthropic sector to advance their missions. And we will engage in facilitated peer-to-peer dialogue with real-world problem solving using the WISE Council workshop model. Before our speakers share their reflections and their experiences, Heather Ludeman will put this series into context from her perspective as one of the funders supporting it. Thanks so much, Heather, for joining us today.
Thank you, Keisha, and good morning. I'm Heather Ludeman, and I'm a program officer at the Packard Foundation, leading our U.S. ocean conservation work. And on behalf of the Doris Duke, Hewlett, and Packard Foundation, I really want to thank you all for joining us today. We're so excited to be launching this webinar series. And Keisha and her team have just done an incredible job in developing this virtual learning series that will carry on throughout the remainder of the year. And we're really so grateful for their partnership. As Keisha mentioned, the purpose of this series from our perspective is really to create space for environmental funders looking to center racial equity in their strategies. And we recognize that some of you are probably earlier in this journey, while others have been doing this work for a while. No matter where you and your organization are on this path, we know we have a lot to learn from each other and that there's also no finish line. We also have much to learn from Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are doing environmental and stewardship work. And so this series will also focus on centering their leadership in the development and execution of conservation strategies. Given that racial injustice is so starkly on display in the US at this moment, this series will be focused on justice and equity through more of a domestic lens. Recognizing that, I fully expect the discussions and learnings from this series are going to have broader applicability for those working internationally. So that's all to say, everyone is welcome. We expect that everyone will be able to get something out of this series, kind of no matter where in the world you're working. We also view this series as a critical step in accelerating the pace of change in environmental philanthropy towards strategies that center people of color in creating more just and equitable solutions. We hope that this can be a safe space for difficult conversations that are needed among environmental funders. And for those of you that may have several colleagues from your organization joining us today, that this can help catalyze conversations within your own organization or with the funders that you just partner most closely with. We also hope this series leaves you feeling energized to prioritize equity and justice more squarely in your work, and that as a community, we are in a better place to grapple with the role that racism has played historically in conservation, the role that white supremacy culture continues to play in the field, and how we can shift our work to be in stronger relationship with Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. I am sure that many of you feel the same sense of urgency for change that we do at Packard, Doris Duke, and Hewlett. So we really thank you for joining us on this journey. We look forward to learning alongside all of you. And with that, I will pass this back over to Keisha. And thank you to our speakers as well for joining us today. It's really great to see you, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, Heather, and I think you nailed things well. There is no finish line. This work is never done, and so let's dig in a little bit deeper with our speakers today. I have the pleasure of sharing with you a little bit more about Kim Moore-Bailey and Patrick Gonzales Rogers. First, Kim is the Executive Officer of Youth Outside, where she provides the leadership and vision that drives the organization's work to ensure that young people who have been traditionally or historically underrepresented in the outdoor movement space have the opportunity to connect with nature in culturally relevant and inclusive ways. Kim is a long-standing thought leader on topics related to equity and inclusion in the outdoors and environment. She supported many individuals and organizations in thinking about how to ensure that everyone has equitable access to nature and designing outdoor spaces and programming that supports this goal. And we're really honored to have her with us today. You'll also hear from Pat Gonzales Rogers. He's the Executive Director of the Bears Ear Intertribal Coalition, where he oversees the direction of tribal land management plans for the Bears Ears Monument. Prior to coming to Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, Pat was most recently the Senior Tribal Policy Advisor at EPA and has also served as the Director of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Washington, D.C., where he was in charge of the federal advocacy, legislation, and congressional affairs of that office. And we're really delighted and honored to have you with us as well, Pat. First, you'll hear from Kim, and I will turn things over to her now. And thanks again.
Thank you so much, Keisha, Heather, everyone at Keisha Harris and Associates, and to the supporters at Hewlett Packard and the Doris Duke Foundation. It's such an honor to be here with everyone today. So here is our reality. We know that organizations run by Black, Indigenous, and people of color are systemically underfunded when compared to their white-led counterparts. These inequities have been in existence for many years. And in 2019, the Hewlett Foundation approached Youth Outside to see if together we could begin to address this in some small way. The vision was to launch a new grant making and capacity building program in 2020 that would prioritize leaders of color working in their communities around issues of conservation. We agreed that to build a more just and sustainable movement, we must center and prioritize building power with and allocating resources to leaders of color and organizations rooted in communities of color. But before launching the program, we really wanted to better understand what did an effective, meaningful grant making and capacity building program look like for the folks that we wanted to engage. So in designing the program, we really wanted to follow the philosophy that we are going to use as we implement the program. We want to follow the lead of those on the ground who are actually doing the work every day. So we spoke with, surveyed, and listened to everyday folks, representatives from our target organizations and programs and individuals to ensure that the grant-making program would really serve their needs. So earlier today, perhaps you might have received an email from Sarah that included a handout that looks like this, and it includes some of the information that I'm going to cover now. So who did we engage? Over 200 respondents checked in with us either through the survey or through the focus groups or through our interviews from across the country. When we asked about operating budgets, it was a complete range, with 43% reporting under 200,000, and 57% reporting that their operating budget was between 201,000 to over $1 million. When we asked about staffing infrastructure, again, a complete range from 100% volunteers to over 10 FTEs. In some of our conversations, I learned about some of their staffing and operational challenges, like Wi-Fi doesn't always work, or sometimes it didn't exist at all. They would have to drive up the road and wait for their phones to actually connect. Sometimes they said that they had never actually met someone from a foundation until I showed up. Many of them talked about not really connecting or even seeing themselves as a conservationist or an environmentalist, but that there was something that was happening in their community that made them want to take action. So they were doing it on the weekends or in the evenings, or just operating out of their garage, or had converted their den into this office space until the work could get done. But they wanted to know how they could actually make it their full-time job. They wanted to know how they could actually raise funds to actually cover this work. So then we asked about what did they need? And really there were 4 findings, and it was striking how consistent it was from Baltimore to Albuquerque. The first thing was the money, and I'm sure this is not surprising to any of you. General operating sustainable funding, and I'd say at a meaningful level, and meaningful for everybody was very different. And we probably spent about 5 minutes talking about the money. And then we spent about 45 minutes talking about this idea of capacity building and professional development. And I would say, we spent an extraordinary amount of time on the survey side trying to separate those two words. Those two words became blended together. And there was an overwhelming enthusiasm for this idea. The third finding connected to this idea of capacity building and professional development was the type of capacity building. It wasn't this big lofty ideas around strategic planning or financial modeling. It was questions like, what is an LOI? How do you find grants? There was questions around, and this was clearly pre-COVID, could we attend conferences? Could you convene the cohort so that we could meet each other? There's a recognition that during tight budget times, often this is the line item that gets cut, if it existed at all. So could that be re-engaged? There was a real hunger and enthusiasm for some of these components, this idea of how do you build a board? How do you recruit board members? And a real desire to try and make their organization stronger. They joked in some of the focus groups that they just sort of rotate board members, that they just sort of pass it amongst the group that was in the room. And they said that that's probably not the healthiest way to do it. They also expressed interest in sort of HR practices. They said, I'm the ED because I was the program person. I was there, so they just sort of moved me up, but I've never had any formal training. The fourth finding, and this one was a little bit of a heartbreak, but definitely something that I could relate to, was this idea of being the subcontractor and the connection around lack of trust. And it feels like there's been a lot of writing about this lately as well from a literature standpoint. Almost to a person, everyone sort of asks the question, you know, why are we always the sub? Why can't we get the big grant? Over and over and over again, we heard stories about larger organizations sort of reaching out to their organization and asking them to what felt like to do the heavy lift or the big work in their community or their side of town for what felt like a much smaller portion of the larger grant. And I would say that I know how that feels. Youth Outside was approached in a very similar way, in our case by a university, to do the same thing. And it's sort of this pause or this moment where you're being asked to put your intellectual capital and your personal capital on the line, and you're wondering, you know, to what degree? If you say no, what does that mean? And if you say yes, what does that mean? And how much do you put out there? And at what point do you stand up for yourself? Do you say yes once and do you say no the second time? The bigger question though was why? Why do we not have the money? How come they won't come directly to us? Some of the organizations talked about strategies that they implemented, getting their CEO to sit on the board of that organization, trying to understand from an insider's perspective, you know, what's the secret sauce? How do we get the money? But to no avail. So we heard these 4 things. And so the question was, now what do we do about it? We had all this really great data. So how do we build this program? We want to move forward with making an equitable grant making and capacity building program. And so that's what we're going to do. That's what we are doing. One that centers those that are doing the work, rooted in trust and relationship building, and recognizing that it takes time. We are building now the capacity building and the professional development piece. We heard what they told us, and we are excited to implement this program that centers their voice and their knowledge, rooted in authentic relationships and trust building. So with our data and support from the Hewlett and Packard Foundations and North Face, we've launched this program this year as we continue to work to raise the funds. You know, at one point someone asked me, you know, what would happen if the Liberated Paths Fund, which is what we're calling it, isn't funded? And I thought about the people that I met last year and the people that I know that are doing the work in the communities and the frustrations that they express and the decisions they wrestle with every day. And I responded that hopefully many of them will continue. And for many, it sort of feels like purgatory. And the person that I was talking to laughed, and I said, you know, it's this idea of like never thriving, always trying to just survive and nothing changing, but you keep going and you keep doing the work and you hope for change. So let's change that. You know, to build a more just and sustainable movement, we must center and prioritize building power with and allocating resources to Black, Indigenous, and leaders of color and organizations rooted in the communities that we serve. I hope through your own work, you'll join us in doing this. Thank you again for having me here this morning.
Thank you so much, Kim. Those insights are just pivotal. The things that you're sharing, that you're hearing, that they're experiencing in terms of their interactions with the sector. It also gives hope, because I think that you're really kind of setting the stage for part of what we do through this series, and that is reinforce accountability. And so your work could not be more timely. So we're going to transition over to Pat now, and he's going to share his perspectives too. So Pat, thank you.
How is my audio? Is it good? Great. So I want to start. That is my native tongue. I am native Samoan. If you didn't know, Samoan is the sexiest of the Polynesian groups. So I want to start off with that. And then I want to give thanks, especially to Keisha's group. They're just incredibly top-notch, insightful, and incredibly instructive and helpful. And as well, I want to acknowledge Hewlett Packard and Doris Duke for bringing us together. And finally, I want to thank you for organizing this. I think most of all, my wife and neighbors are relieved that I'm not in underwear, slippers, and a robe. So this day of tie and a blazer is a welcome opportunity. So I want to start off that we are at a critical junction of where we are regarding a dialogue and a path forward. But it cannot just be an inflection point or a seminal moment. We need to create a path that is articulity attached to it in regards to our relationships in the conservation community. So what am I speaking about? Well, from my perspective, where I sit on the street, there are three major entities that coordinate and work together. And for the most part, they work pretty well. However, we need to identify what this triangulation is. And that is funders, large conservation groups, and then the rest of us, the smaller nonprofits that represent communities of color and the underrepresented. And it is in that order. We are on the bottom of this triangulation. And so you first need to identify what that dynamic is. So before I go on, I do want to make mention and preface and underscore, for the most part, our relationships with our partners. And in my instance, I work with about intimately 5 or 6 conservation groups. Some of them are fairly large, some are regional. And I want to say that this relationship is largely benevolent, it is open-minded, it is gracious, it is courteous, it is always one towards achieving goals, but it is also tethered to a rather pedantic, sometimes putative, sometimes provincial, and at the worst of times, dynamics that intersect against being tone deaf and parochial. And so I want to put that out there because I want you to give a lens into the dynamic in which I approach some of these relationships. So I think the first point is, where do we, the communities of color, derive from in this 100-year history of the modern conservation group? And what I would tell you is, for people that are native, that are indigenous, that are of color, we already paid the price to be here. We were the original stewards. We are the people that were conservators before there was even a modern kind of vernacular to this term. And in fact, people of color built this through the blood and treasure of their own lives, the things that these groups are now intersected against. And so I don't ask for a place at the table. I know I have a place at the table. I view these things not through a mission statement. I view them through a cultural and moral precept that was given to me. And that was my birthright. My birthright is I have a responsibility to serve, period. If it's not in this position, it could be somewhere else. And it doesn't have to be an executive director. So I don't go through the conscription of an institutionality of creating a narrative. I know where I come from, and I know I stand on the backs that everyone is before me. And that is a stark difference relative to conservation groups. So now that we've kind of established that, I want to talk about, in some instances, the situations that I have personally experienced. And so I don't want to kind of talk anecdotally. I don't want to talk through a third party. I'm only going to speak to the things I've actually experienced. So if you look at the 7 or 8 largest conservation groups, they occupy 60% of all foundation funding. That means about 35 to 40% is the remainder, and hundreds of groups like mine, like Kim's, and hundreds of others have to cannibalize themselves for this remaining portion. Now think about that. We have these large conservation groups. They're doing good work. However, we have given them in some ways both a societal and institutional deference. And those things are based on size and capacity, right? And this notion of exceptionalism that is also conflated to meritocracy. And what I will tell you that is, while they have been successful in the verticality of their organization, much like what we know in the contemporary literature and the conversation is, meritocracy in many instances is a myth. It is. Some of these conservation groups, and I did a query of their salaries, some of them border $1 billion in an annual budget, and their executive staffs, I won't mention the name, one of them has over 40 people making over $250,000 a year. Now, I know they have a very large footprint. That said, Kim and I now have to compete against that. And it's also based on these assumptions that they're integrating us as in part of the equation. So that's an example. I also want to talk about, if you look at these 7 or 8 large conservation groups, and some of them have fairly large boards. So if you take that 7, 8, there's about a little north of over 200 board seats. I know for my community, the Native community, there are only 5 board members in these largest 7, 8 groups. Think about that. There are only 5 Native board members in their 7, 8 groups, and 2 of them are mentioned twice. Now, the folks that are mentioned, they're incredibly experienced. They bring a lot of wisdom, but for Pete's sake, there are more than 5 Native people you can put on your board. Also think about 96% of public lands are west of the Mississippi. Where are most tribes located? West of the Mississippi. So in terms of what we've been doing, because of the federal trust relationship, Native communities, by and large, have the most experience. They have done these things, but yet in these boards' wisdom, 5, 2 mentioned twice, Leonardo DiCaprio is on half these boards. Think about that. So he's a great guy. He funds a lot of things, but he's on over half these boards, but you can only mention 3 because 2 are mentioned twice on these boards. Also, I'll give a real life experience of my own. I've been asked to serve on a board. I was flattered. It was also analogous to applying for the National Security Agency. There were 4 interviews I had to go through for one of these. At the end, they offered me a board position. I subsequently found out there were other board members, and I do know, and I studied this when I was at Yale, and it's an area of my focus is corporate governance, especially within Native organizations. Because you compose a board for different skill sets and experiences, right? I came to find out there were some board members, because of their large use of funding ability, they didn't have an interview. They were just asked. So where is both the transparency and the equity of process relative to my position? Now, I appreciate you asking me, but I'd like to be on the same playing field as the next person, period. That's it. I don't want anything special. I want to operate as you operate. So that's another thing that we can think about. Another thing that I've dealt with is I've come to find out after the fact, because I work with a lot of partners, that in many instances, my partners vote on me for my funding. Think about this. My partners vote to a funder on my funding. Now, the Bears Ears, the only reason why it got where it is because of the political status of the tribes. And so they are the point of the spear relative to the endeavor. And it is because they're domestic sovereigns. However, this is analogous to your neighbors deciding on what plants you plant and what money you're going to plant in your backyard. I'm just saying, and when we think about equitability and a fair playing field, we have to think about it in ways as why are they weighing in on the monies we receive? And so some of this is the institutionality, but it is also more, and what I think this is the more important point, it is the comfortable lines of communication that takes place behind the scenes. Funders funding funders. Because they speak the vernacular, because they have the same lexicon, and because they have the same history, it subordinates other communities against this. And so while there is benevolence, there is also a prescription on how they fund and how they talk to people directly. Finally, what I want to say is, as an organization, because we're involved in litigation, we cannot and will not receive federal dollars. And a lot of people don't realize that. And so maybe they think another door is opening. But because we came into partnership with other partner groups, we are kind of locked out on the outside. And now we have to have this relationship with both the funding community. Yet, what we do know is organizations of color on a per capita basis are funded dramatically less so than larger white-run organizations and have more strings attached. And so when you talk about capacity, and when you talk about metrics, and when you talk about analytics, there is, again, the same lexicon, and we are placed in these positions without resources to fit in a circle into a triangular box. And so in some ways, there's a great and vast disparity. Now, I'll kind of close this up now in terms of, well, what are you asking for, Pat? And the things that I would ask are not just more kind of reach out for staff and programmatic positions. And while that's important, because that's how people form their careers. And if you read the literature, if you don't create a path, and then that path is conceived to rise to a next level, people of color will eventually leave the organization. So you have to create a pathway where there's a verticality for them to move. Second, and this is probably more important, you have to hire more senior executive and board members. The board member position, while in sometimes just in optics, if you have a working board, will align resources and assets towards the mission and objective. And what I tell people is, we're not trying to create a Benetton commercial. This is not Baskin and Robbins. We do this because you will have a more robust deliverable. Your objectives and mission will be more vibrant. And that's why you do it. So I encourage you to think about that when you consider the identification of board members. And finally, what I would say is more direct grants to our organizations. As Kim says, we often act as a subcontractor. We are not a subcontractor. And how they got this notion is fairly ridiculous. It borders on monolithic and being a trope. That when you speak to us, we speak to the whole community. We had a pre-meeting on this and we were joking. We are not the grand poobah of the Black community or the Native community. We have to do the same kind of reach out, the same kind of synergy with communications, the same kind of build out. However, when I tell people that we have to do this, they look kind of astonished that I thought you knew this community. I do. I know the tone. I know the cadence. I know how they speak. But that does not mean that they automatically lend their trust to me. Like any relationship, you have to build this out. It takes time, resources, and it takes a lot of patience, not just on our organization parts, but with the funding agencies. And so I would ask you to consider these things going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. I really appreciate you, both you and Kim, and I really want to pull something you said about what we want, which is to operate the way that you operate with your customary grantees, that more money goes directly to BIPOC-led organizations. That is what we've been at and been here for in the last 4 years in InDEEP, to really get that message across. And you both have laid out the circumstances very well for our group here today. We have a time to take just one, maybe two questions. And so we did include a link to Padlet. If you haven't included any questions or feedback that you have for Kim and Pat, you might want to do that now. We're going to take one or two questions, and then we will share all the things that are here in Padlet after the call and after the session, and they have generously agreed to give feedback on any additional thoughts that come to mind. So please do feel free to click on that link. I am going to start out with, I think, the first question that was posed. What are some ways for funders to find BIPOC-led organizations that are rooted in communities of color? What are specific examples of how to best do this? Oftentimes, the same BIPOC groups receive funding from all of the large environmental and outdoor funders. There is a need to get way beyond our bubble. Who wants to take that? Kim, Pat?
I'm going to defer to Kim unless she wants to field the question.
Go ahead.
Unless she wants me to field the question.
Go ahead, Pat. Go ahead, Pat.
Oh, okay. So what I would say is, again, we deal in a lot of institutional assumptions. Now, I will say Hewlett has been a fantastic partner. Andrea is the continental standard of a program manager. And you know why? She's taken the time to get to know us and see the nuance and make a grant directly to us. And you know what that says is two things. Pat, I trust you and your staff to get this done. And two, there's going to be an accountability, and well, it should. What I would say on the other side of it, if you were to look at the converse, there are entities out there, large entities, that we won't name, that have Bears Ears funding as part of their foundational development package, specifically names it. We don't get $1 from them. But in public, they've told me, as well as others, if you need anything, come to us. We're there for you. And I did. I went to the #1 person in the organization, and I said, we're at a critical juncture. We need your assistance. They were so gracious to give us nothing. Nothing. And so think about that. Now, we don't have a proprietary right over the Bears Ears, despite this being ancestral and cultural homelands. But this organization sees in their goodwill to broadcast a development package that is all over their website, fundraise, there are no dollars back to us. And then when I go to them behind the scenes to say, would you institutionally support us? The answer was a very eloquent and polite no. So I'll leave it at that.
So I will echo, Andrea is wonderful. And I would also say, I asked the question sort of back, like what is keeping you from discovering new grantees? I can't answer that for you, but if there is the desire to try and broaden your grantee pool, what is the commonality that you are seeing? And then what is from perhaps broadening your grantee pool? Is it geography? Is it budget size? Is it what Pat said, and that you're just sort of funding those that you're familiar with or you're comfortable with? Are you fearful of taking a risk? I think that's the beginning of the conversation. If there are others that you can reach out to support you to try and do some of that work, great. If not, then I think that's where you're going to find yourself, what's the definition of insanity, sort of doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. I think that's really it. It's trying to try and take a risk. You might have to think about, are you willing to be perhaps the first large funder? Large, right? Are you willing to cut a grant that maybe is not as large as your normal grant size? Are you willing to meet a grantee where they are? Perhaps, or is there infrastructure in place that you're asking them to have that they don't have? And are you willing to sit and work with them in that way? Those type of questions is there things in place that are keeping you from connecting? Is it a Wi-Fi issue, right? So there are organizations that are definitely out there. But I would ask the question back, what is the infrastructure that your organization has in place that perhaps is keeping you from connecting with them? And if your organization isn't able, which is true, are there entities out there, intermediaries out there that can help you then bridge that gap so that you can reach those that you do want to connect with?
And I would say one thing in closing. We are the victims of the dichotomy of scale. For many, many institutions, our particular yard hose is not large enough because they're tied to the fire hydrant. And they want only ones that can create a capitation of the fire hydrant to their end objective. And so to that, I would say, seriously consider that paradox.
This is absolutely perfect. I really, really cannot say how much I appreciate you, Kim and Pat, for joining us and really opening the conversation that we're going to delve into deeper in the second part of this session. I know that others of you have posted some questions on Padlet. Again, Kim and Pat are very generous. They said they will share responses, and then we will share them back out to you as a group. So thank you again, both for your time and your contributions and your invaluable insights.